everyone, thank you for joining me here at Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations. My name is Laura, and today I'm talking about Conclave by Robert Harris, published in 2016, and I'm comparing it with the movie directed by Edward Berger, which was released in 2024. And he also directed the new German adaptation of All Quiet on the Western Front, which I also have a video for if you want to check that out. But some of you may know that I am on a quest to read and watch every Best Adapted Screenplay winner. So that is what has led me to cover Conclave, because it won Best Adapted Screenplay just this year. And I have so many thoughts on this book and movie, and so I'm really glad to have the opportunity to talk about this, because if it hadn't won, I would not have covered it. And so I'm glad it did, in the sense that it has given me the opportunity to talk about things, it's given me the opportunity to talk about certain topics that I honestly kind of try to avoid talking about on my channel, because I don't know, like these can be very controversial topics, and they're also topics that people are very passionate about, and they're also topics that, you know, they're so personal and individual, and they're things that I am still in my journey working with. But, you know, something we'll get into with this is that, you know, your faith is something that everybody is on a journey with, and it doesn't matter how old you are, like it's still a living thing that is changing and growing and transforming. And so I guess I shouldn't be waiting for me to reach an age where like I'm set and there's no more evolving, right? Because faith and spirituality is something that is always evolving. So anyway, this book and movie is about the Catholic Church as they vote for a new pope after one has died. And the book in particular is full of Catholic terms that I personally am not familiar with. And then also in the first chapter, we are introduced to just so many characters. And so a combination of all of these names plus all of these Catholic terminologies, it kind of took me a while to get comfortable with this book and to get used to it. But once I did get used to it, I really enjoyed reading this. But the movie, I think it's just easier to follow right from the start, since you have faces to go with the names. And while you are seeing a lot of Catholic rituals, it is easier to follow than simply having to be reading about these Catholic rituals. But yeah, I am not Catholic, and I know a little about the Catholic religion, but I apparently didn't know much at all about popes, because I had no idea that they voted on who the new pope would be. That's just something I never thought about because it just didn't impact me. So I never even considered how a new pope is chosen. I also had no idea that when you become pope, you choose a new name to go by. So I thought that was interesting. And yeah, in general, as someone who isn't very familiar with the Catholic Church, I did learn a lot, and I did find it really fascinating. And I do have some conflicted feelings when it comes to organized religion, but reading this and watching it, you know, there is something about the rituals and ceremony and special clothing and the formality and the traditions of it all, that there is something about it that I do think is kind of cool. And I would love, you know, any Catholics that are watching this video, I would love to hear from you, whether you are a former Catholic or a current Catholic. I would love to know what you think of this book and movie if you have read or watched it for yourself, because I personally thought that both of them were respectful of the church. And also Robert Harris went to great lengths to be as accurate as possible in his descriptions of things. You know, he went to Rome and he was able to enter into these sacred places that, unless you're a cardinal or whatever, you're not allowed in, but they let him in. And he also spoke with cardinals who have participated in conclaves. And so he really, again, he tried to be as faithful to the details and as accurate as possible. And so I did think that was really cool. But again, I would love to hear from actual Catholics and just what you think of all of this. And yeah, again, like I said, seeing all of this in front of you in the film and all of the rituals play out and these spaces, I thought was really visually stunning. And then the performances are fantastic. And so while neither book or movie is like a 5 out of 5 stars, I did still really like each of them. And the book and movie both have similar endings. And so when I first experienced this with the book, I was in shock. I had not expected what happens to happen. And it took me a while to like process it and think about it to decide how I felt about the ending and if I even liked it. And I think now I have come to a place where I know how I feel, so we will be getting into that later in the video. And from here on out, I will now get into the details of the plot, which means there will be spoilers going forward. And I also wanted to acknowledge just yet again that I know a lot of the topics I will be getting into in this video are things that are very personal and people feel very strongly about them, you know, organized religion, spirituality, faith, gender identity. And so when I share my own opinions on these topics, they are simply my own opinions and my own views. I am not saying I am, you know, correct and everybody needs to agree with me. That's not how I feel at all. And now to get into the basic plot overview. So the movie is very faithful to the book in many ways. So for those who have not seen the movie or not read the book, I'm going to begin with just going over the basic gist of what happens. And for starters, in the movie, the main character, I think his first name is Thomas, so he is Thomas Lawrence, whereas in the book, the main character is named Jacopo Lomeli, and so they change his name from book to movie. But for the most part, I will just refer to him as Lomeli. So Lomeli is what is called the dean of the college, and so when the Pope dies, it is his job to officiate this conclave. A conclave is what it is called when the cardinals from around the world are sequestered in the Vatican and vote for a new pope. And there are multiple rounds of voting, and the voting does not end until a man has gotten at least a 2/3 majority vote. And there are more rules to this, like if a large majority can't be reached in time, like in a certain number of days, like there's these different things you need to do. And the book gets into these details because Lomeli is worried that this conclave is going to last the max amount of time, and he does not want that. However, this isn't really, like, it's kind of a concern for him in the movie, but not as much. But yeah, there's like more rules in place if it lasts a long time, but I'm not going to get into that because it doesn't end up happening. So all you need to know is that a person needs a 2/3 majority vote to win. And the cardinals are kind of broken up into two groups, you could say, because you have the liberals and the conservatives. And Lomeli is more liberal, and he is friends with a cardinal named Bellini, and Bellini is definitely, you know, he is very liberal, and he is the one expected to win. Like, the media thinks that he is the most likely to become pope, and the main guy in the conservative group who has the best lead is named Tedesco, and again, he just has more extreme conservative ideas on how the church should be run. And then we have a guy named Tremblay, who is maybe a bit more in between these two, but Bellini, he does not want the papacy. However, Tedesco and Tremblay both actively want to have this position, and that's what makes them dangerous. As is said in both book and movie, the men who are dangerous, the men who must be stopped, are the ones who actively desire it. And as the cardinals gather together, one unexpected man shows up named Benitez, and in the book he was Filipino, whereas in the movie he is Mexican. But the former pope had made him a cardinal in pectore, which means that it had to be done in secret in order to protect Benitez. And in the book he also gets into how, like, the pope made a new rule for this in pectore cardinal so that he would still be a legit cardinal even after the Pope's death, even though no one knew about him. And so that is something that the book makes sure to clarify. And so yeah, he is still allowed to participate in the conclave, even though no one else had known he was a cardinal until now. But the voting goes through a lot of ups and downs, and early on, Bellini is not getting the amount of votes that they had hoped for. And instead, a man named Ariame is doing really well, and he would be the first ever Black Pope. But he also has extremely conservative views, which worry Bellini and others. However, he, is taken out of the running because it turns out there is past drama with him because 30 years ago he had a child with a woman who is now a nun, or she was a nun at the time as well, I guess. But she just happens to be here helping out, serving the cardinals during this time. And so this is how this news comes out, and he is kicked out of the running because of this. And I won't totally get into it here, but we find out in both that Tremblay is the one who had this nun brought here to help with the conclave at the request of the Pope before he died. Or I guess he didn't call her to help with the conclave because the Pope was still alive. So the Pope just had Tremblay call this nun to come serve at the Vatican. But then after Adayame is no longer an option, Tremblay ends up being in the next position alongside Tedesco. However, Lomeli finds out that Tremblay bribed cardinals, and before the Pope had died, he had actually wanted Tremblay to resign, but Tremblay lies about this. But thanks to Lomeli, Tremblay's bribery is exposed to all of the cardinals, and so now he too is no longer an option. And so then in another round of voting, now Lomeli is in the lead alongside Tedesco. However, there is then an explosion when a terrorist attack happens, and this causes the cardinals to have a disagreement as Tedesco speaks out about how much the church needs to stop being so open-minded to other religions, and they need to realize that this is a war between Catholics and, other religions of the world, basically, and it's a pretty hate-filled speech. But then Benitez speaks out and he says, "I have seen our holy places bombed and our brothers and sisters laid out dead in lines in the Middle East and in Africa. I have comforted them in their distress and I have buried them, and I can tell you that not one of them, not one, would have wished to see violence met by violence. They died in the love of and for the love of our Lord Jesus Christ." And in the book, at this point, Lomeli, he is in the lead. However, Benitez has also gained a decent amount of votes. And in the book only, he also, in this moment, he tells people like, hey, anyone who has been voting for me in the next round, please vote for Lomeli. He is the one we need in charge. Whereas in the movie, they leave out this part. But the movie still does have this speech about how, love is still the answer and they shouldn't respond to violence and hate with more violence and hate. And then from here in the next voting round, it's kind of assumed that Lomeli will end up winning. However, Benitez gets the majority of votes. He gets like over 90 votes, which means he is now the new pope. And now I'm going to move on from the basic plot gist because from here, the book and movie are just slightly different. So in the movie, after Benitez wins, Lomeli, or Lawrence here, since I'm talking about the movie, he finds out that Benitez is intersex and had been booked to get a surgery to remove his uterus, but ultimately decided not to get that done. And he also hadn't even realized that he had some female organs until he was an adult when he got his appendix out. And obviously this is a big deal due to the church's stance on gender, but also because, only men are allowed to be cardinals, let alone popes. Whereas in the book, Benitez seems to have the anatomy of a female. However, due to a condition, it led his parents to think that he was a boy when he was born, but also how, he talks about how boys were the better gender. And so maybe the parents also just believed what they wanted to believe. And so they raised Benitez thinking he was a boy. And in the book, the specific terminology used for his condition is fusion of the labia majora and minora. But when Benitez is an adult, he is injured and he is taken to a hospital and a doctor sees him. And this is when he finds out the truth. And it leads to a huge identity crisis because he just had no idea. And so he tells the Pope that he needs to resign. And so the Pope, obviously this is before the Pope had died. And so the Pope sees Benitez in person in order to discuss this and pray about it. And Benitez decides that he will go to a hospital to correct his condition and also get a clitoropexy, and then he will officially resign because of his gender. However, he decides not to get the surgery and to just remain a cardinal, and the Pope is aware of this and just is okay with it. And he tells Lomeli the reason why he didn't go get this surgery in the book, and we read, "I am what God made me. It seemed to be more of a sin to correct his handiwork than to leave my body as it was." And he says the same thing in the movie as well, so that is also why he doesn't get the surgery to remove the uterus. Also, even though as far as his gender goes, I'm just going to keep calling him he because that is what he considers himself and that is what he calls himself. And so I do think this is an interesting change that the movie made because in the book in particular, we are often hearing about the women's roles within the church and how they are limited. And the movie does talk about this as well because we get the scene where Bellini, before the first round of voting, Bellini is sharing like how he will lead the church. And he says one of his views are that women should play a more active role in the leadership, essentially. And one of the guys who is kind of like his advisor of sorts, he tells him maybe we shouldn't tell people about that because it's too controversial for a guy to be openly saying he wants women in more roles. And then of course we also have Sister Agnes in both book and movie. When she stands up for Lomeli/Lawrence, she says, even though women are meant to be invisible, we nonetheless have eyes and ears. But in the book, we just hear even more about how Lomeli won't be around women, how his whole life in the church, he isn't around women, of course, because the fear is that it will lead to sex. And to be a leader in the church, you need to be celibate. And again, how women are not allowed in any leadership position. And even the nuns, like as far as the conclave goes, they are just there to serve the men in the church and are generally ignored. And again, this is something that is mentioned a lot in the book, is how the nuns, they are just kind of invisible. I should say, though, that the movie does highlight this in its own way, as we see the men preparing for the conclave and then also seeing the women prepare, and how the nuns' role is, again, to cook and serve the men and to help them, showcasing how they have a less important role, essentially. And there's a scene where they are inside, I think maybe it's when he's giving his homily, but all of the men are inside, and we see Sister Agnes standing outside the building, right? And so in the book, the fact that their new pope is anatomically female is very significant. And in the book too, it is very clear that Benitez won because it is what God wanted. And the men had been inspired to vote for him, despite the fact that up until a few days ago, none of them even knew he was an option. And I did like this aspect of the book personally, because I do not think the patriarchal structure of any church is something God wants. And I know this is going to bother a lot of people and rub them the wrong way. And, this is just my views, and I'm sharing it because it does relate to the story. But I think the reason why so many churches have a male-only leadership, or a mostly male leadership, is because just the sexism of the world and the pride of men. Not because God doesn't want women leaders. And so my perception of the book may be skewed due to my own personal beliefs, but that is how I interpreted the ending, is that it is the world who don't want female leadership, because when God causes events to occur in order for the correct person to win the papacy, it is someone with female genitalia. And yet this is also tricky territory, because even though Benitez, anatomically might be female, he goes by male. And so then part of me is is it transphobic for me to view it in that way, considering he considers himself male? But it's also interesting to note that, I feel like trans people make the choice on their own as far as what their gender is, whereas Benitez, he was raised being told he was a boy. So it's not like he made a conscious decision on his own. It's just the way he was raised. And so it's just what he truly always thought. But it is interesting to note that when Benitez has to choose a new name for his papacy, he does not choose a male name, because most of them choose the name of one of the apostles or whatever. However, he instead chooses the name of a virtue and chooses innocent. And it had been more common for a pope to call themselves the name of a virtue back 3 centuries ago, but for a long, long time, that has not been the tradition. So it is interesting to note that this person chooses a name that has no gender connected to it. But I almost think the movie tries to make the story less controversial by making Benitez intersex. And I do like their line too, when Benitez says, "I know what it is to exist between the worlds of certainties." And I think the movie is showing how gender isn't a black and white situation. Whereas the book, while it still does have that message, I feel like it takes it even further by, Benitez isn't intersex. They are again, anatomically female here. But I also wanted to mention how in the end of the movie, we get a scene where Lawrence is looking out at nuns leaving a building, and this could signify that women in the church will soon be allowed to break out of the confines the church has been keeping them in. And, I love the significance of this final scene, but of course this is only applying to the fictional world of this movie, because obviously who knows when, if ever, major churches will allow women to be in significant leadership roles where they are the ones calling the shots. But speaking of certainties though, in both, Lomeli gives a speech at the start of the conclave, and he goes off script and speaks from the heart. And in the book, he feels like God is speaking through him. And some of what he says is, "Let me tell you, the one sin I have come to fear more than any other is certainty. Certainty is the great enemy of unity. Certainty is the deadly enemy of tolerance. Our faith is a living thing precisely because it walks hand in hand with doubt. If there was only certainty and if there was no doubt, there would be no mystery and therefore no need for faith." And it's interesting because in the book, this is not in the movie, just in the book, there is another guy who gives a speech right before the voting, and he is really upset at what Lomeli had said. And he was like, I was shocked when I heard what the dean said this morning. Like, he thinks we're in need of doubt. Like, that's what we have a shortage on. And so he really pushes against this. And he's saying, like, our world is being taken over by all sorts of isms, and we need a leader who will keep us on the steady, narrow course, not a leader who is going to be okay with doubt, essentially. But I really liked what Lomeli says personally, and how faith is a living thing and we need to tend to it and care for it and feed it. And I also personally, I think faith is stronger when you face the doubts rather than acting like doubts can't exist. Like, I mean, come on, certain religious ideas are pretty out there and weird if you really think about it. And so I think acknowledging the weirdness of it and acknowledging maybe that there is some room for a doubt when it comes to certain details, I feel like that makes your faith stronger because you're willing to bend in the wind just a little bit rather than trying to stay up, stick straight, because then if a strong wind comes, you're just going to topple down and collapse. But something I should also mention is that Lomeli has been struggling specifically with prayer, and he sees himself as unworthy due to not having as strong a faith as he feels he should have. And the theme of belief in the church versus your belief in God is something that comes up in both and is really interesting to think about. And Bellini is talking to Lomeli, and he is telling him, like, in the Pope's last days, he was struggling with faith. And Lomeli is like, oh, faith in God? And Bellini is like, no, he never questioned his faith in God. He questioned his faith in the church. And this is something, we hear this in both book and movie, but the book goes into this even more into the headspace the Pope was at. And saying he was jaded with the church maybe sounds too extreme, but he was definitely, realizing the imperfections of the church and its leaders. But Benitez, though, is someone, as Lomeli talks to him throughout the course of this story, he is someone who is like stalwart. Is that how you say that word? Stalwart? He is very stalwart, strong in his faith in Christ, and he puts God above everything else, including above the church. And this is something that makes Lomeli think, and he's like, wow, like, which have I been prioritizing, God or the church? Because they're not necessarily the same thing. But he also has been praying throughout this conclave to be guiding it as God would want him to, while also being influenced by the world, because he doesn't want the conclave to last too long because it would make the church seem unstable to the outside world. And yet Benitez is like, maybe God wants the conclave to last a long time. Like, who are we to decide what the correct amount of time is? And we shouldn't let the media impact our choices. Like, we should be guided by God, not the media. This is just another fascinating topic about how to bring a church, any organized religion that is centuries old, how to bring it into the modern day while still holding on to the same principles and traditions and beliefs, but while still changing, because like expecting a church to stay the exact same way for centuries is just kind of silly. And of course, no, that's not the case with any religion. As far as I know, they all experience changes because it has to, because as the world changes, of course, certain things within the church are changing. And I don't think that is a representation of like, well, God must have got it wrong the first time because now it's needing to change. And that means like God doesn't know what they're doing or whatever. Like, that's not what it is. I think, one rule might fit great for 1897, but then once you're in 2016, like, of course it's going to have to change because the times and the people have changed. So I feel like people shouldn't be attached to these like little details within their religion because those will change. What you should be attached to is the deeper principles and the meanings and, the core beliefs. Those are what you should be attached to because those don't change. But near the end, Lomeli, he breaks the seal to enter the Pope's former room because he feels prompted to go in there, basically. And once in there, he feels guided to search the bed and finds a secret compartment that the Pope has been keeping papers. And this is when he gets proof that Tremblay had been bribing people. And I also did want to say that you could see this as being symbolic of him. It's this empty tomb, and it could be symbolic of like, Christ's empty tomb, and he's like entering this empty tomb. Maybe some symbolism there. But he takes these papers to Bellini, and he's saying that they need to expose Tremblay. But Bellini is too scared of the pushback from this, and Lomeli realizes that Bellini he's too much of a coward to become Pope, and he's realizing like, wow, like it's it's good you didn't have a chance at being Pope because you're not brave enough, you're not strong enough for this position. Even though Lomeli, he had been voting for Bellini in every voting round up until now. And throughout the story, Lomeli, he personally has no desire to be Pope. And when asked by Bellini, he claims that he has never even considered what his Pope name would be. But then we have the vote where Lomeli is in the lead, and it is assumed that in the next voting, he will win. And so even though in this final voting, even though he is casting his vote for Benitez, he is still kind of thinking that he will win. And so he realizes that he's had a Pope name in mind for a long, long time. And he also starts to fantasize about what he will say to the crowd when he meets them for the first time as a Pope. And he even starts to jot down some ideas for what he will say in his speech. And in the movie, we later see how when Bellini asks him what his Pope name will be, he's able to quickly tell him. So in the book, we all got this in his head, but this conversation between he and Bellini was a good way for the movie to show, actually he does have a Pope name in mind, because he was very quick when Bellini asked him. But I thought this was interesting that even though he and Bellini are both saying how much they do not want to be Pope, and both mean it, right? They're being sincere, and yet they both acknowledge sooner or later that they can't help but to desire it at least a little bit. But then, of course, Benitez is the one who ends up winning, and ultimately Lomeli feels like God guided them to the right person for this role, and that Benitez will be able to carry the church forth with love and unity. And so Benitez seems to kind of be the only person who did not have a Pope name in mind, because when asked what it will be, it takes him a while to respond. And so maybe Benitez is the only one who genuinely did not want this role and truly did not expect it. And so that is what made him so worthy of it. But I did want to read a section from this part when the voting is taking place, again, when Lomeli thinks whoa, I'm going to be the next Pope. And so as they are tallying up the votes, we read, Lomeli sat back in his chair and waited while the scrutineers and revisers went over the official figures. Afterwards, when he tried to describe his emotions to Bellini, he said that he felt as though a great wind had lifted him up off his feet and whirled him into the air, only to set him down abruptly and go whirling up after someone else. That was the Holy Spirit, I suppose. The sensation was terrifying and exhilarating and certainly unforgettable, and I am glad to have experienced it. But once it was over, I felt nothing except relief. It was the truth, more or less. But yeah, by the end, Lomeli, he truly believes that Benitez is the one who was meant to be the Pope. And by the end of the story, he seems to be at peace with his faith, or you could say that he is at least at peace with having doubts within the faith and knowing that maybe the doubts are there for a reason, as a way to help him be more open when God wants something unexpected. And the movie also has some symbolism with turtles I wanted to mention. So earlier in the film, Benitez was outside with the turtles in the courtyard, and Lawrence comes up and talks to him. And then in the very end, one of the turtles has come inside, so Lawrence carries it out. And a quote from the director reads, I remember seeing a fountain full of turtles on the Vatican grounds. They were there as a gift to the Vatican, and when I looked up what turtles mean in different cultures, it turns out they hold a lot of varied significance. As a result, they're great to include in a film because their presence can be open to many different interpretations. In one of those cultures, though, a turtle symbolizes transformation and change. In another, they symbolize wisdom and age. I thought it would be a nice culmination for Lawrence to carry the turtle back to the fountain towards the end of the film, keeping those ideas in mind. And again, faith is a living thing, and it's not something that remains static in one's life. And so the turtles representing both transformation as well as wisdom is meaningful, because as we grow and learn in wisdom, we transform and our faith takes on new shapes, just as Lawrence's has by the end of the film. And also, along with the turtle representing the transformation and wisdom within Lawrence, I think especially because you could say, the turtle comes into the building, and so maybe that represents that the church is changing, right? You could even be like, it's changing from within because the turtle is inside the building. Maybe I'm reading too much into that, but I do think that the turtle also represents the transformation happening within the church. And then I just want to share some quotes I liked from the book, or just scenes I liked in both book and movies. So in the book, there's a part where Lomeli is thinking about the imperfections of these men who run the church. Also, by the way, there's a scene in both book and movie when they are talking, they're trying to figure out who a good candidate is and how they have these different different flaws. And one of them says, like, we serve an ideal. It doesn't mean we are ideal. But the quote I specifically wanted to mention in the book reads, "Out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made," meaning no perfect thing. And so even if you do believe in a specific organized religion, while God is at its head, it is still run by imperfect humans, but also how maybe that's kind of the beauty of it too. And also just the danger of putting any church leader up on a pedestal because, he might be the Pope, but he's also just still a man, right? An imperfect man. But I also like how when he spreads the papers on Tremblay in both book and movie, Tremblay goes up to Lomeli and he's like, "I suspect you are to blame for this." And Lomeli is like, "No, you are to blame for this." But yeah, as said, everything that happens during this conclave ends up happening for a reason, and it leads them to be guided to vote for Benitez, proving just how God works in mysterious ways. It's a cliche, but it's true. But when it comes to book versus movie, so while I did like the book a lot, going into the movie, I assumed I was going to like it better because, there was just so much awards buzz around this film, and the cast and the direction is just amazing. And yeah, I thought that as good as the book was, I also thought this story would be better served in a visual medium. And in some cases, that's true. Like I said, getting to see the rituals play out was better than just reading about it. And again, the cast is perfect. Everyone was just incredible. And yet, I was kind of surprised because ultimately, I think the book still wins over the movie, as good as the movie is. And, I think the book also did a really good job at conveying how God's influence is what led them to vote for Benitez in the end. And I saw a lot of reviews for this movie, how even people who liked the film, they critiqued the ending, being like, it was just so preposterous that Benitez would get the majority vote when these men had never even met him up until like 2 days ago, but he makes one speech and suddenly everybody votes for him. And so a lot of people just felt like it was so unrealistic. But that's kind of the point. And in the book, I feel like this is shown better too, that again, they voted for him because they were prompted by God. Because logically, yeah, it doesn't make sense. But in a spiritual sense, like when God is in control, the unexpected can very well happen. And that was the point. Same with him finding the papers in the Pope's room. In the book, it is very explicit that he felt guided spiritually to look on the bed, and that is when he finds the papers. But yeah, the movie must have just not conveyed that very well, considering how many people complained about these different aspects. And then again, just the book gets into so many fascinating topics that it just gave me so much to think about. And to circle back around to how surprised I was by the book ending with what we find out by Benitez, initially I was just like, wow. And yet, when you think about it, Harris had been laying the groundwork throughout this book, because throughout this book, I kept thinking of gender and how it impacts the church and how they view women, and it comes up often enough that it was on my mind throughout reading this book, And so I think he did it in such a great way, though. I've never read anything else by Harris, but he did it in such a great way because he was threading in this theme, and yet he did it in such a subtle, nuanced way that it wasn't like, oh, clearly this will come into play by the end. Like, I did not think that. I thought it was just one of many themes he had going on. And so the more I've thought about it, the more I like this ending. And again, I like how he kind of prepares you for this with all of these different things he's mentioned throughout the course of the book. And you could say the same for the movie as well. But of course, when I went in to see the movie, I already knew what the ending would be, assuming they stayed close to the book. So I was just already aware. So it was a different kind of experience. Again, I'm not even part of the Catholic Church, but I do have my own experiences with organized religions. And it's just such an interesting topic, no matter where you sit on your views on it. And again, I did like that. I feel like the best critiques of a structure of a religion are the ones that do so respectfully. And I did think Thomas Harris is the one who wrote Silence of the Lambs. This is Robert Harris. So I did think Robert Harris. I did think he was respectful towards the church. And so I think that's what makes his critiques they work so much better, because he's not just writing like some book that's hating on religion. And so I think it makes his critique so much more effective because of that. And again, I thought the movie was respectful as well. And anyway, basically what I'm saying is that the book wins. I did like it a lot. And ultimately, I would recommend both book and movie. And yeah, they give you a lot to think about. So anyway, I guess that is Conclave. Let me know your thoughts down below. Whether you agree or disagree with me, I'm down to talk about it as long as people aren't incredibly rude. And we're all just on different areas in our spiritual journey. And, you know, whether you're an atheist or a Christian or a Jewish or Muslim, whatever, we're all just fellow humans trying to figure things out. Anyway, yeah, kind of a lot of heavy topics here today. But anyway, let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Bye.